Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to take your seats, if those outside can hear me, we're going to get started in 1 minute.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get moving with our final keynote of the day. I hope that everyone enjoyed the concurrent sessions. And since no one can be in all rooms at the same time, I want to let you know that the material will be translated and will be available up on the Govmaker website in the days and the weeks to come. So you can check back and you can see what you've missed from some of the other sessions you were not able to attend. Right now, I'm very pleased to welcome our third and final keynote of the day, Dr. Tracy Loriot. Dr. Tracy Loriot is an assistant professor of critical media and big data, communication and media studies in the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University. Her areas of expertise are critical data studies, small, big, and spatial data policy, spatial media, data infrastructures, and open data, open government, open smart cities, and the preservation and archiving of data. Current research activities include open smart cities, precision agriculture, the making of homelessness, and data and technological transformation at Ordnance Survey Ireland. Many of us will remember Tracy as Canadian Open Data Leader of the Year 2016, an award received at the Canadian Open Data Summit in St. John. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Loriot.
Thank you. That was really nice. Did you get the grilled cheeses for the snacks? Weren't they great? I totally love those grilled cheeses. I stockpiled some. So they told me that they were going to take them away, so you better get some before the talk starts, because they're really good. Thank you very much for inviting me to your great city and to this great province again. I love coming here. This time, sadly, I can't stay for very long, but I think I'm going to try and make my way here over the summer and maybe drive around a little bit and hike around a little bit. So maybe I'll see you then. So thank you very much. Je peux aussi prendre des questions en français. Je vais faire la présentation surtout en anglais. Ma présentation n'a pas été traduite parce que c'est de ma faute, parce que j'étais un peu en retard avec ma soumission de la présentation, mais ils vont vous les traduire plus tard et j'espère qu'ils vont vous être utiles. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about technological and data-based society. And what is this data-based and technological society? What does it mean? Well, let's go through a scenario. I wake up in the morning with my watch. First thing I do is I check my phone. I look at my watch and I register my sleep on my phone. And then I kind of stretch and I go, oh, too many grilled cheese sandwiches when I get on the scale. Look at my little calorie count, get a little grumpy. Look at how the calorie count is counted with Health Canada's database that does the calorie count and the steps, et cetera, with different types of foods. And then I go, okay, fine, I'll do my thing because I ate too many grilled cheeses when I was in New Brunswick. But then I'll tie that in with how many calories I've burnt and maybe how many more I will burn later on in the day and associate with my steps, and I'll put that on my phone and on my apps. And then a little bit later, as I'm having breakfast, I'm going to take a look on my iPad for some information, maybe post some stuff onto social media, and then, you know, I'll make my way to work, and oops, I was on my way to work and I forgot to turn the heat down, so I'll just go on my phone, and I forgot to lock the door, so I'll get on my phone and actually lock my door remotely, and I'll turn the heat down remotely because I live in a smart house. I don't, but let's pretend that I do. But that information is also tied with some Government of Canada data with regards to energy consumption and also with sunrise and sunset, so I can set my clock accordingly. Finally, it's the end of the day, I come home, I start watching some Netflix with my TV, and it's tracking what my preferences are, and so on and so forth. And then I go home to bed, and I read a book, some paper, but I take images of the text that I translate into some data that I might want to refer to later into my digital notebook, and that's, of course, all enabled through my Wi-Fi system at home, and all these things called unique identifiers that are kind of standards that happen in the background with these devices, and it all goes into the big giant cloud, right, where all those data are stored and all these different services that I have, and therefore I have all of these really interesting big data that are produced by me, for me, that I just give away for free in all these different services and apps in exchange for these services. Now, we could imagine this scenario a little bit differently. What if all of these devices were hooked into historical sites in New Brunswick and trails? So I could lose my calories on New Brunswick trails. I could go to historical sites. You could have the restaurants, the good restaurants, and maybe the little naughty ones too, in there that would tell me the calorie count of what's going on in those restaurants, and I could tie that in with my hiking and with my activities and my historical tour. Maybe there's some local documentaries that are made here. Maybe there's other types of gyms that I could lock into, and maybe the cloud isn't the big corporate cloud. Maybe it's a localized New Brunswick type of service where all these devices are integrated. We could imagine that. We don't, because we buy these disparate devices, but we could imagine integrated tools. So in my academic speak world, the process of datafying everything we do, of quantifying ourselves, is called datafication. That's what we call that term. But let's think a little bit bigger. Let's think of traffic control rooms, and then we think of smart buildings. We also think of surveillance technology. We might think of biometrics that are captured about us when we travel borders. We might consider some big control rooms that they have in China and many places in the world. We might think of this one just as Obamacare. What's the infrastructure in the background of that? We might think of CRMs in Walmart. We might think of UPS and all of its location-based services, financial sectors, all of our credit cards, loyalty cards, et cetera, membership cards tied in, satellite, GPS, social media. Basically, we are a data-based technological society. We live with these things every single day. And therefore, we should have a critical perspective about what these technologies are about and how they affect us, how they shape our communities, and also how we actually shape these particular technologies ourselves. Now, something uniquely different is happening is now, of course, and I mean, many of these devices would be considered IoT instantiations kinds of devices, but now we are embedding technology in our environments. And they tend to be very corporate-centered platform types of technology. So we do it for agriculture. We are doing it also in the context of smart cities. We are doing some interesting, cognitive computing type of work or machine learning kind of work to match seeds and genetic streams and so on for seeds and packages, but parts of and integrated into the production chain, sometimes of Monsanto or John Deere and so on. Or we're thinking of smart cities and smart buildings in a smart state. And all of these things happen with not much consent on our part. We allow these things to occur, or we buy these services because it is easier, or we are locked into a particular agricultural, industrial type of situation where our insurance companies and our co-ops and so on lock us into these particular kinds of systems. So in other words, again, not only are we technologically and data-based individuals with all of our personal devices, our environment is becoming much more technologically enabled. So in my world, what we say is that data are more than the unique arrangements of unbiased and objective and politically neutral facts. There's no such thing as an objective, politically neutral fact. As soon as you have a budget line associated with collecting data, and all of us who do collect data know how hard it is and how expensive it is, that these are political decisions or budgetary decisions of some kind. These data also don't live independently of the institutions, the ideas, the people, and the organizations within which they're situated. How we collect data in Fredericton is very different than how we collect data in Ottawa, and very different with how we collect data in Toronto and Montreal. Very different contexts, very different environments, very different population size, very different concerns. So they're also very localized in the different places and institutions. But also, they are not inseparable, or they are not inseparable from the underlying infrastructure by which these are delivered to us. The internet infrastructure, for instance, ubiquitous computing as a kind of infrastructure, and the standards and the chips and all kinds, and RFID technologies related to that. Or the underlying internet network, or just simply computational power, cloud computing, or the electrical grid, for instance. These are all part of enabling that particular kind of infrastructure for us to produce these kinds of data. It also means that they're not inseparable from the way we think, our forms of knowledge, how we do this kind of work. So scientists at the Canadian Space Agency are different from scientists at Environment Canada, and they're different from a public administrator that are collecting data, and they're different than a fisher out in the oceans fishing. They're all different data cultures, and they have different data practices. Also very different political economies. Monsanto, IBM, and John Deere are very different than our colleagues who gave us this wonderful talks on marketing earlier on in the lightning talks. That's a small local company. Very different political economy, very different kind of corporate situation. The organizations, institutions, laws, and regulations that we have that govern these things are not only localized, but they should maybe be national, and in some cases should be global, where we sell this stuff and the places. Concurrently, these things are not inseparable from the actual technologies themselves. So we think of the code, the algorithms, the platforms, the software, the data, the actual cloud, the warehouses where we keep this stuff, the ground stations that we put up in the north that are tied to the satellites and that are capturing the data as they pass through. These are very material things. You cannot separate the context from the actual systems in the places. So it's never just a number. It's a number in that big kind of institutional context. And people like myself would be called critical data studies scholars. We're a brand new domain in academia. But we're also starting to see people who do platform studies, people who do software studies and code studies, people who do algorithm studies, because just like we can recognize that there is no such thing as bias and politically neutral or unbiased and politically neutral data, it is the same for technology. Technology and data are social constructions. We construct the technologies in the way that we want, or maybe we don't. Maybe we just receive technologies and believe that there are no values embedded in these technologies, and these scholars are actually unpacking those kinds of assumptions. So generally, when we talk about data, we talk about data technically. We talk about data quality, we talk about format, we talk about form. We don't talk about the underlying actual infrastructure that delivers it. But people like myself and many of you in this room that I've talked to today, we do think about data ethically. We think about them in the political economy. We think about them spatially and temporally. And today, I had the really good fortune to meet one of my heroes, John McLaughlin, who I'd never met, but I had read his books for many, many years. And so it was kind of like a little rock star groupie moment on my part here in New Brunswick to meet him. So it was a wonderful moment. But he thinks about spatially, temporally, and he has infrastructural systems thinking. And then also philosophically. So how do we Oops. So how do we think about these data in different ways? So citizenship, us, right, as citizens. And really, it could be residents, because not everybody is a citizen, but the residents, the people in a particular place at a particular time. It implies a kind of agency, right, that we are agents, that we have the ability to change technology, especially since we live in technologically and data-based societies, particularly since we have that particular kind of specialized knowledge. In a way, it is up to us to act as data-based and technological citizens, and we'll take a look and see what that means. So Andrew Feenberg, another Canadian, not local, he's on the Pacific Coast at Simon Fraser, he would say, to have agency, you have to have knowledge in a technological and data-based type of society. You also have to have power, the ability to influence, the ability to inform, and you also have to have the right time to act, the right time to do things, the right time to have that conversation. But it is more than the delivering of data and the delivering of technology. Is about data politics. It's about socio-technological politics, and it's about being able to have that conversation as agents, and to assume that we have the legitimate right to guide technological decisions and that we have the legitimate right to guide database decisions. So what does that look like? I'm going to step back a little tiny bit and talk about open data, because we say all kinds of things about open data, but I think we forget its roots. And we've seen a bit of a disconnect across time and space. So I will talk about this evolution of technology and data in the Canadian context from a little bit to the past and take us to where we are now to jump into more about what technological citizenship might look like and things we might want to be concerned with. So the early days of Antarctic treaties in 1959 was where they said scientists shall share their data. So open science has very old roots, and in fact, openness comes from science. Openness comes primarily from geography and geospatial. I'm a bit biased, I will say, towards the geographers of the world. But it does have its roots in geography and in the geospatial type of space. I brought this one up this morning, 1992, sustainable development. What data do we need to do sustainable development? How do we deliver those data? How do we package those data? How do we think about those data? And how do we do purposeful data collection specifically for that purpose? The Open Knowledge Foundation, it's in 2005. So 1959, we're talking openness, and it's not really until 2005 that the term open data kind of shows up. We have open sharing, or access to public data happening with global infrastructures with regards to GPS and the satellites and the radars of the world. So if those large corporate entities can talk about access for public good, certainly in governments we can discuss access for public good. We have a kind of very technocratic type of definition of linked data and the 5 stars of open data, the Panton principles in science, and here we are today to the Charter and the International Open Data Charter, of which Open North is a steward, and Canada and Ontario and others are trying to implement it and bring it in. That's just the Earth Summit. So this thing here, what is this thing about? If we take a look at the very, very other side, access to data, not open data, because that wasn't a term that we used. It was always, earlier days, it was access to data. And access to data meant primarily the cultures who were involved with access to data at that time. It meant the physical sciences, the geological surveys of the world, right? The oceanographers of the world, the people who were involved with primarily geospatial type of data, but also the social sciences were very much involved. The people who were working with census data, for instance, people who were working at research data in universities. That's where the data, those were the days that we were talking about access to public data. And so we will know, some of you might be familiar with the concept of open access publishing. Well, open access publishing comes from this group of people early on. And it's not really until 2005 that we start talking about and using the word open data. And it's still, we start seeing physical sciences and the social sciences disappearing, and we see a whole new crowd at the table of chief technology officers, chief information officers. We see IT people. We no longer see the subject matter specialists, and we no longer see data users. And we no longer see the science. The science begins disappearing, and therefore the good practices of lineage and authority and authenticity and all that kind of stuff disappears. And the conversation moves away from census and geodata towards administrative data. So generally, when we talk about open data, what people are thinking about, not exclusively, but generally, they're thinking about administrative data. They're not thinking about scientific data or geospatial data. Later on, in about 2015 or so, we start hearing a little bit about local and traditional knowledge. And what does data sovereignty look like for Aboriginal people who want their data back? And what does it look like when they don't like the way that they're being classified and they're asking for those data back? And also, what does it look like when we respect Inuit for their scientific knowledge of the North, and we merge that scientific knowledge with Western notions of traditional science? We start seeing that. We start seeing more crowdsourcing, but smart crowdsourcing, as in Statistics Canada doing crowdsourcing, and we start seeing citizen science emerging. So we start seeing intelligent contributions to the production of data. A little bit different and somewhat of the antithesis of administrative data, because it's no longer, it's hard to say who has authority over these data. So that makes government nervous, and it should make government a little bit nervous. And so conversations need to occur to consider, well, how would government receive crowdsourced data from citizens, and what would be the authenticity and the quality standards that could be associated with that? But certainly, if Statistics Canada is starting to do it, we can start thinking about it as well. And then we start thinking about smart open data. And this is where we're a brave new world that we're in today. But it's not really open data, and that's why the question mark is there. Because when we talk about operational data or infrastructural data or sensal data or social media data or AI machine learning data, we're not talking about open data anymore. We're talking about a whole other game. It could be private sector. It could also be some of the data in science. And if it's open science, it will be open. But generally, we're talking smart cities, we're talking precision agriculture, we're talking about predictive policing, we're talking about surveillance, we're talking about a whole other bunch of data that we haven't even begun to get a handle on in government. And so we're still talking administrative data, and I think we're all adorable, and I include myself in that conversation. But really, we need to move the conversation to some of these other types of data because they're starting to be embedded in our physical environments. And they're starting to converge in interesting ways. It also means that we can't just be working with open data people anymore. We need to be working with civic tech people on the civil society side. And both open data people and civic tech people maybe need to start having political conversations or technologically citizenship conversations about data and technology, and not just about opening of data, but a broader conversation of how do we begin to learn and talk and have intelligent conversations about data. Now, I'm going to go through some things where we see data in government, or the kind of conversations that I've been participating in for the last year. I feel like I've been on a bit of a road show. And some of the things are very interesting to me. So I'm going to walk you through. So we have digital strategies, and we had a wonderful keynote this morning talking about digital strategies. And these are some of the definitions of digital strategies. And in its ideal, most simplest of form, it's about delivering services better to people or in their communities from government over the web. When I look at digital strategies, though, and I look at them in the context of other things, I look at digital strategies in terms of open government. Well, you could have a digital strategy, and it may not be an open government digital strategy. Those things may not be related. They could be in different shops. You might have a digital strategy, and it might not have anything to do with open source, and it might not have open data. I have seen digital strategies that, in fact, have that. The Government of Ontario is a unique one. There's a few of them, but there aren't many of those kinds of types of digital strategies. They may not be considering open platforms. They might, but they generally are not. Unlikely that they're thinking about open science, because science happens in another shop. This is still on the IT side of the equation, and they're definitely not talking about smart cities and precision agriculture. So that's kind of a vacuum of a conversation that's not happening there. Then we look at open government. If we look at open government, it's about making government more accessible to everyone. And I'm not going to belabor it because I'm making the assumption that we know something already about open government, about creating more open and transparent government. There's all kinds of great principles, and we have the meetings right now that are happening in Brazil, and Canada's the representative of the Open Government Partnership at the moment. And so there's all really great work that's ongoing. But even when you look at open government doesn't necessarily have to have open data. It could just be about freedom of information. It could be transparency of a few things on its website, but it may not adhere to all the other standards of openness that we expect from open data or from open government. It's certainly, generally, it doesn't have to be open platforms. Socrata platforms are not open platforms, for instance. You can buy an IBM platform and still be open government. That's a proprietary platform. They also may not be thinking digital strategies. So that's, again, a different kind of division. You know, similar space, but not having, maybe sometimes having shared conversations, but not necessarily cross-pollinating their work. They're unlikely to be talking about open science, and generally speaking, open government, like smart cities and precision agriculture, is not really on their agenda at this time. But when we go to open data, so we have open data, and we have this definition of open data, which is the common definition that's from the International Charter, which I spelt improperly right there. And it's about technical, legal, and characteristics necessary for the blah, blah, blah of data. We know it, right? Because we've been talking about it all day. And that's a very technical definition of open data. It's not a philosophical discussion about open data. It's a bit legalistic because we do have a little bit of information there about licensing, but generally it's very technical aspects of data, and not even data quality. The qualities of data, but not data quality. When we go to open data, it's probably associated with open government. It doesn't have to have an open platform either. It doesn't have to be open source, and in fact, a lot of open data people talk about all kinds of APIs, and they talk about Google base mapping. Google Maps is not an open system. It is a proprietary platform, and you lose the rights to your data when they're in that proprietary platform. But a lot of open data enthusiasts would say that that's open data, and I would argue that's perhaps not open data. Generally, not open science. We're starting to see the proximity between open science and open data, but they're not cozy yet. Right? They're not at the same bar yet. So hopefully we'll get them at the same bar soon. Generally, open data is not talking about digital strategies, and we're trying to map open data onto smart cities, but you can have a smart city without open data. We are also beginning to have great conversations about open data. A few more things of boring stuff, and then we'll get to some good stuff, I promise you. So open science is another national conversation, another global conversation that I'm so pleased that we're finally having. Especially since, you know, I go back to 1959, and I go back to UNCED and the United Nations, and I go back to the geospatial and the GEOS work. For me, the science is the old conversation. It just pains me to see that we haven't done open data in a scientific way. That, in fact, we've reinvented some wheels that already existed, and they were really good wheels. And they actually understood sensors, and they understood devices, and they understood interoperability, and still do. And they understand standards and specifications and open platforms, whereas we can't necessarily say that that's the case at the moment for the open data crowd. So open data tends to be policy heavy, but it's not analytic heavy, data use heavy, as in the people who advocate for open data are not necessarily data users, whereas the scientists are. And we start looking at science, and you just start looking a little bit at some of the things that they think about, right? Open access, open data, open reproducible research, open APIs, et cetera, in the context of science. Of course, not all scientists and not all sciences, but generally when we start looking at open access and open science, this is how sophisticated the thinking is. So when we have open science, yes, open science is about open data. Yes, open science is about open platforms. And yes, open science is about open source and open publishing and open access. It may or may not be associated with open government. It's starting to be, but the people involved in open science are just doing science. They're not thinking about, you know, going to Brazil to talk policy with global affairs. It's a different shop. It's a different group of people. It's a different kind of thinking. And then they're unlikely to be involved with digital strategies, although they may have a localized one, but they're unlikely to think of it as a national one. And of all of them, they're the closest to smart cities, although they may not think about them. They at least know devices, and they at least know about data being collected by devices. If we look at platforms, we have a fantastic example of an open platform with the Federal Geographic Data Platform, back to my old spatial data infrastructure days, and back to John McLaughlin and Dave Coleman, who's also here in New Brunswick, who are really the gurus in this space. This is a way to have, accessible, interoperable, open specifications, open source, open architecture, shared services, yada, yada, yada kind of platform. This is platform infrastructural thinking. It's not perfect. It's got some bugs in the system, and it's hard to get into, and it's hard to get the admin data involved in it, but at least it's got that infrastructural thinking. It's thinking more pervasively and across institutions. So when we look at open platforms, we go, okay, open source, yeah, that open platforms talk about open source. Open platforms generally might be dealing with open science, but they don't have to. They generally could be dealing with open data, but you could have an open platform that doesn't have open data in it. That's perfectly possible. The open platform people, in the context of the federal one, yes, of course, they're thinking open government, but you could have an open platform that doesn't really deal with government or deal with open government. And it may not be thinking in digital strategies. And in fact, the infrastructure people and the spatial data infrastructure people and the digital strategies people often don't sit with each other and have that conversation about, one is talking about infrastructure, one is talking about a digital strategy, and in fact, they're both talking about infrastructure in different ways. So that's very interesting. And certainly the open platforms, you don't see them with smart cities or precision agriculture. Same with smart cities. We have smart cities, we have precision agriculture. They tend to be pretty corporate heavy and corporate centric. And it is a way for chip makers and telcos to sell more stuff and integrate more stuff. And great application outcomes can be derived from these technologies if that is what we ask them to do for us. At the moment, they are doing stuff that we haven't necessarily asked them to do. So when we get to smart cities, we have, yes, precision ag. Do we have digital strategies? No, although smart cities at a city level are often synonymous with digital strategies. So we're starting to see a little bit of convergence of digital strategies in smart cities at cities level, but not necessarily at the provincial and territorial and national levels. They're not talking about open science, which is unfortunate because agriculture is a scientific domain. It is also unfortunate because cities also, when you're talking air quality, you're talking traffic systems and engineering, that's quite scientific type of work, but yet there isn't that much of a proximity with open science. Very little proximity to open government, but generally lip service. Oh yes, we're open, until you look and you realize that the smart cities are not open and the precision agricultural systems are not open, and they definitely don't have to have open data. But you can have a perfectly great smart city system, great depending on how you qualify great, or a good deployment of a smart city instantiation that has no open data. And that's problematic because smart cities are claiming that, oh yeah, we're open. And we're starting to see open data disappearing within cities, being subsumed by smart cities, and therefore we're losing actually the presence of open data in these particular kinds of environments, and certainly not open source and open platforms. So all that to say is that all these kids need to get together and play because they're all having separate conversations, right? You know, we need to get them all, like, good thing Lorna brought us all here because now we can start having this conversation. But honestly, these conversations need to come together and these communities need to come together. And there needs to be this integration of data and technologies at all levels of government. Because there's a lot of overlap with these things, and they don't necessarily have to be open. And my big fuchsia circle would be the openness circle. We need to have that conversation. But that conversation doesn't deal with this. It doesn't deal with data brokers that I had my little intervention earlier. It doesn't deal with those guys. It doesn't deal with all of those Fitbits and et ceteras that I went over at the very beginning. It doesn't deal with any of that. It doesn't deal with big data, as buzzwordy as it is. It doesn't deal with that at all. And it doesn't really deal with, the politics and the ethics and the problematic issues that we start seeing with predictive policing or corporate surveillance. So in other words, we're having great conversations about data and digital strategies, et cetera, on infrastructures, but we're not dealing with some of the fundamental ethical and policy issues that are facing us right now with these technologies, because we haven't applied our knowledge in that way and our critical thinking in that way. And I don't think we've necessarily, as we say in French, on s'est pas assumé dans cet espace. We haven't assumed ourselves or situated ourselves in that space to have that conversation. But really, we're the people to have that conversation, because we're the ones who kind of know this stuff a bit more than the general public, because that is why we're sitting here. If we start looking at data brokers, right, Axiom is one of the biggest data brokering firms in the world, billions and billions of dollars, and this is not an exaggeration, about a company that we know barely anything about. Oracle does it the same. And if you just look around, I know it's hard to read because you're far away, but those are basically the thousands of data points that get collected about you at any given time. It's not an insignificant amount of data points. Our conversations about open data, open government, digital strategies, spatial data infrastructures, and open science don't cover this. We're not having this conversation. And this is a conversation we should be having. And this is a conversation about the convergence of corporate surveillance, which what we call, in my world, dataveillance. So surveillance with data is dataveillance. And so the fact that that much data can be collected by corporations means that there's a kind of dataveillance, but there's a kind of convergence with government dataveillance, because government can't afford to do that stuff. We were talking about that earlier. Government is not collecting all this information about us. It doesn't have the capacity to. Every now and then it might do, license plate recognition. You might drive over a sensor to change the lights. Every now and then there might be some cameras to protect some buildings, et cetera, but it's not capturing all of our device data, but it could. I could foresee a moment where your Fitbit is integrated with your insurance company, and then Health Canada says, before you see a doctor, send me your data. And what would that look like, right? It could converge. It could be, oh, well, those welfare people, just put a bracelet on them, because then we'll know if they're looking for jobs, right? That could happen, and we say, well, it's just welfare people. We don't have to worry. It's people. They should be looking for jobs anyway. They have nothing to hide. They have nothing to worry about. They can just wear that on their ankle. We do that for criminals, but it could also be for other types of communities who have very little power to deliberate more broadly. So these convergences are quite problematic, and none of those conversations are we having. We're not having conversations about what's going to be encoded in the systems that we're deploying and embedding in our environments. Farms are pretty important. That feeds us. Right? And in the Canadian context, that's very significant in an agricultural resource-based economy. What's going to be encoded in that? Will it be the smart city type of IBM farm and the John Deere farm? Or will it be a more hackerspace civic technology kind of farm? And will it be a civic lab, not a kind of techno-libertarian MIT lab? It will be one that really thinks of civicness and local community-based type of thinking. And it might bring in things like civic tech. So in this case, can food security, ecosystem farming be encoded locally in a precision agricultural system? Why not? We're the ones who are deploying them. We get to make them what we want them to be. We don't just have to be empty, neutral recipients of technology. We should be making decisions as to the kind of technologies we want and what we want to code into that technology. Which value set do we want in those particular systems, and who's going to help us have that kind of conversation? If it's going to be smart cities, what kind of quality of life do we want in our cities first before we deploy the technologies, and how do we encode those values in that particular system? So here we have a federal government, my federal government, your federal government, our federal government, that has a smart cities challenge, and there's no values. It's going to be a very technical, I believe, we haven't seen it yet, but my fear is it's going to be very technical, it's not going to be standards-based, it's not going to be interoperable, it's not going to be open, it's not going to be open source, it's not going to be open platforms, because there's nothing to specify that it should. So what are we going to get? So for us, working in government and speaking with government, What technologies do we want, and what do we put in the call for tender so that we get the kind of technology bids that we want? And how do we structure those things with the values that we want encoded in that? Ottawa just experienced its first autonomous vehicle experimentation, and now we have a cluster. There's something really interesting we could do here. Could we rethink transportation altogether? Like, what would happen? Could we rethink car ownership? Can I just call a car? Right? Why not? Why couldn't we just call a car? Why couldn't we all have equal access to a car? What if we pooled resources and bought a bunch of autonomous cars, and then we called them up and shared them between and amongst ourselves? What would that look like? Concurrently, what does the loss of autonomy look like? Because the autonomous car means we lose autonomy, right? Because the car manufacturers, the software, et cetera, the platform has a lot of information about us. We also lose anonymity. You can't visit someone you're not supposed to visit at night or whatever, right? You're not supposed to sneak and have a little drink somewhere or whatever. You're not supposed to do that because you won't be anonymous. You will always be watched in the autonomous car. But also, will you have the right to repair an autonomous car collectively? Will we have the right, might be fun to drive around New Brunswick with the Italian version of the software, right? What would that look like? Or the Montreal version, for that matter, where the red lights are suggestions. So what would that look like? Because those are the kinds of values that will get encoded, because it will learn locally, but it will have that local kind of flair to it. So those are really interesting questions, and we're not having those broader questions. We're certainly, when we're talking open data, open government, et cetera, we're not talking about garbage. Right? The lifespan of all of our devices is 2-3 years, and we like all the shiny new ones, so we keep getting shiny new ones. And we don't think of the semi-precious metals that are mined in the Congo. And we don't think of the Internet of garbage and the Internet of stupid things. Because when we're talking of billions of devices in our environments with very toxic, very small batteries, that if you swallow, the chances of dying are very high, certainly if you're a child. Because if anybody wears hearing aids, you know that those batteries are very, very dangerous. What does it mean when we are deploying these things all over the place? We have to maintain the things. We have to replace the things. We have to own the things. Who's going to own the things? I can tell you, I'm in a building that has a lot of sensors that don't work right now at Carleton. Like, it's one of the new buildings, and you wouldn't believe, for a year and a half, we've been trying to resolve one of these sensor issues. Or every time you wash your hands and no water comes out, does that make you crazy? Makes me crazy. So, those are just kind of the little instantiations where now you need a plumber, an electrician, and a computer scientist and a software engineer to fix your tap. That's where we're going. So, we better think about what we deploy in our environment. So we need to be reducing waste. We need to be thinking efficiency, but we also need to think fair labor practices, because this stuff doesn't come from nice, cute little factories that we love with no child labor. That is just a fact. All of our devices come from those environments. I'm sorry, I don't mean to make you feel bad. I understand there's drinks soon, so we can drink our sorrows away, but it's something to need to think about. But also, what happens with predictive policing? Right? So predictive policing, this is Brazil. So this was put out during the soccer game. Now, predictive policing is a very different thing in a paramilitary context. Right? You have a bunch of souped-up guys that have lots of gear and they want to go use it, and they can't wait to be called to go somewhere, and on very short notice. That's one kind of predictive policing. So who manages that future? Because predictive policing, prediction is about managing the future. So who gets to decide who gets to manage whose future? Right? Whose future is being managed? Which bodies are being managed in these predictive policing systems? A predictive policing system is very different in Ottawa than it is in Ferguson in the United States, where we've seen some really terrible examples of systemic racism being encoded into systems. Should the smart city and predictive policing converge? Because, wow, you've already got a camera, right? Why not integrate the camera with the police force? Oh, you've already got a sensor that's not really supposed to read the license plate, but let's make the zoom a little bit better and we'll start doing that. Oh, well, we could tie it in, et cetera, et cetera. So you can start seeing like the kind of technological creep and the momentum creep that happens when you deploy technologies in these ways. Because we're always going to look for cheaper, better, more efficient. Cheaper, better, more efficient. Is it cheaper, better, more efficient, or should we step back a little bit and go, maybe something shouldn't be connected, and maybe we should have some responsibility structures when we think about this? And then who watches the watchers? Who's watching them? So we're still like, I love all of our open data, open government, et cetera, conversations, but we need to up the conversation to another level to think more now about what we are deploying in our kinds of environments. And let's not be silly here. Robots are on their way, and they're going to displace labor. And does a basic minimum income make sense in the context of robots? Most probably so, right? Should we tax robots? You know, if it's up to Microsoft, which our Bill Gates would say, yes, we need to tax robots. So that's interesting. What happens with labor and what happens with retraining? What happens about the data that we don't collect? Because that's also really, really interesting. So those data, that nice and tidy data set, that's missing and murdered Aboriginal women. But when I look at that, that looks too tidy for me. That looks too clean. That looks too sanitized. This is what missing and murdered Aboriginal women looks like. And why do we only now have an official database in the hands of the RCMP? And that database is quite wrong according to many of the families, and who gets to decide about that? That's also a very interesting conversation. The data that we don't collect, the counting choices that we don't make, and the data politics that are related to that particular kind of conversation. Who's taking care of us? Oh my God, like I feel sometimes I look at this stuff and I have a hard time sleeping because I read this stuff every day. And I wonder who's looking out for the public interest. Arguably, that's us. We should be looking out for the public interest because we are involved with the public service, and therefore we should have the public interest in mind. But who keeps us accountable? And right now we have 2 cash-strapped organizations with about 6 lawyers who are doing it all. Right? They're doing consumer protection, they're doing telecom policy, they're doing network throttling, they're doing digital rights management, they're doing Creative Commons, et cetera, et cetera. That's too much work for those 2 little shops to do that, and most countries don't even have those shops. So we are really, really lucky to have the Canadian Internet Public Policy Interest Clinic and to have PIAC, but how do you fund those organizations? Because they don't have sustainable funding at the moment. So what are some of the crazy ideas that we might want to start thinking about? Now, this guy's a bit something, right? So Gerd is a bit of a character. As a feminist, he's a bit tricky for me. However, he has some interesting ideas that he's toying around with. And many of us who've been involved in this stuff are starting to have conversations of, well, what are the 10 things that we should think about? What are the 15 things that we should think about when we're thinking about these technologies? What's our checklist? What's our ethical checklist, if you will? And he says, well, maybe we have the right to remain natural, as in we shouldn't have chips embedded under our skin. Because right now, I was in Sweden over the summer, and there are some Swedish companies where employees are happily embedding chips under their skin, and they're swiping their arm. So brave new world, the future is here. Always remember that the future is always here. And they're doing it in Tokyo, and they're doing it in Taiwan, and they're doing it in Korea. So will we have the right to say no and be organic and not have those things? Will we have the right to be inefficient? Is it always about efficiency? There's a great Massey lecture on the cult of efficiency, well worth listening to. And it's really, really fascinating. It's efficiency, innovation, and disruption. Those words make me crazy, because they're never really defined, and it's something that we all want, right? We all want those things, but what does that mean? And maybe we should hang out a bit and think about the things that we deploy. I'm not saying to not deploy them, I'm saying we need to think about them, and maybe it's okay to be inefficient sometimes. I mean, I frequently make the joke, I don't know about you, but my love life, inefficient, right? I don't schedule everything, because if I did, it would be no fun. Right? So maybe sometimes inefficiency is a little bit more fun than efficiency. What about the right to disconnect? I don't have a cell phone. Do you know what it's like for the big data prof to not have a cell phone? The students go nuts. They're like, what? You don't have a cell phone? I'm going, yeah, but I somehow get you really cool lessons every week, and I manage my life, and I sort myself out. I can do that. What about your children? I say, well, I don't want to talk to them. You know? They're grown-ups. They take care of their own lives. If they're in trouble at school, well, they can wait. right? It's, you know, it's not my fault. I don't have to be there at their beckoning and call every 2 seconds. So they were, you could just see the looks on their face was like, but imagine like 300 of them, right? Like that. So, you know, but when you're disconnected, that means you're watched more, because it's the people who disconnect that are not the norm. And when you're doing surveillance work, it's the deviance that you're looking for, not the norm. The norm is what you expect. It's the deviance. Why is she not connected? Why aren't you connected? Why are you turning things off? What about the right to be anonymous? With all the devices that I walked us through earlier on, forget anonymity. That's nonsense. You don't get to be anonymous in an Uber. Uber knows where you go. Ashley Madison can be hacked, et cetera, et cetera. You're not anonymous in these kinds of environments. What about the right to hire people? What if I decide I want a farm and I don't want robots and I want to hire people? What if I want a factory in New Brunswick that says, you know what, I know you give me all these discounts for having robots, but really I want to hire local people in my factory or in my company. Will we have the right to do so in the next 35 years? Right now, it's kind of, we're not too sure, the robots aren't here, but I trust you, they're coming. What about data sovereignty? The sovereignty over myself, my own data, right? The sovereignty of our data within our borders and our boundaries. So if we think of the agricultural data, that's the food security data about us, about our nation. Do we have sovereignty over those data, and should we? And then, of course, what about technological citizenship? So my question then is, what kind of technological society do we want? And how are we going to shape that data-based and technological society? How do we act as a community of data and technological citizens for public good? Not just for efficiency. Efficiency is not necessarily a public good. It can be, but it shouldn't be the only driver. And innovation shouldn't be the only driver. And disruption shouldn't be the only driver. It should be technology and data for public good. Who and how do we work together to do that? What does data and technological governance look like? Because right now, technology is kind of over there, as I went through all those kind of boring charts that we went through. And data is kind of over here, and digital strategies are kind of over here, but none of them are asking these other questions, and they're not really working together. And it's not really, it's governing of the strategies, it's governing of the infrastructure, governing of the data, but what of governance of us as a technological society and as a database society? What is it that we want, and how does it look? What about, and this was something I was talking about earlier this morning, what about open data and corporate responsibility? Right? So if all the corporations own all the they can use Canadian government data and embed them in their systems and then sell it back to us, do they not have a triple bottom line when it comes to giving back to the community from which they got the data from in the first place? And what do open and ecosystems-based and local smart censored cities and farms look like? That's possible, right? Because New Brunswick is not the same microclimate environment or even macroclimate environment as Ottawa is, or as continental Canada is, or as in Pacific Canada is. They're very different. So these things have to be localized. And what is ecosystem-based farming, and how can we encode that within our systems? It means us asking really hard, uncomfortable questions. Like, it is uncomfortable to ask these things. It is uncomfortable to debate these things. It is uncomfortable to put these things on the table. Because I'm like you, I love data and I love technology. I love it. But I have to temper myself because I'm just shopping all the time, buying stuff, right? And getting all these gadgets and not critically thinking about it. But when we start deploying them in our communities, we need to think about it. So not only do all of these government kind of entities need to come together to help ask these hard questions, but civil society. And that means, I mean civil society as in the social planning councils, as we saw earlier, and those kinds in the community development councils, but also civic tech, and also open data, and also transparency people, and so on and so forth, that form, and CIPIC and PIAC and public interest kind of law. But also the private sector should be part of this conversation. We can't leave them out. They're making this stuff. So how do we have a conversation together about making stuff together that's going to meet our database, and technological types of requirements and needs and specifications. But also journalism needs to be at the table, because we are losing investigative journalism, and that scares the daylights out of me right now. Of course, I'm in a journalism department that is shape-shifting, but we have seen the loss of investigative journalism. With the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, we are lucky to have gotten them, irrespective of the kind of weird circumventions that had to happen to acquire those data. They're really important public good kind of data, and we need to be having those kinds of conversations. So what's the role of journalism in this, and what's the role of academics in this world? I mean, I know earlier people were talking about, well, academics need to translate their work in language that's accessible. I was speaking with Kent a couple of weeks ago, and I was saying, you know, Kent, I do that work. It doesn't count for tenure and promotion. So my merit system, my benchmarks and accountability measures, talking to you today is considered a waste of time, according to my benchmarks and my accountability system. This doesn't go towards tenure and promotion. Well, that's nice. You talk to practitioners. Where's that sole source, single-authored, peer-reviewed, obscure paper in some journal somewhere that no one reads? So me doing that translation work, it has no merit in my domain. I do it as my kind of citizen good, my public interest work, but it is not work that you'll see many scholars doing, certainly not in this way, because it is not valued within our institutions. But then, where do we go look for help? Because that's like, I don't know about you, but that stuff makes me tired, right? And where do we go to get help? Where do we go to get some ideas? And I argue at the moment, the US, maybe not our friends, right? Maybe not the place we can go for responsible governance at the moment, right? Maybe not the place that we can rely on for trustworthy policy that isn't so corporately tied. But Europe is doing some very interesting work. Europe says we are data subjects. So each and every one of us, because data is collected about us, that makes us a data subject in someone's database or as just subjects of the state. We, they say, have the right to receive breach notifications when databases are hacked. We should have the right of data sovereignty, over our data as data subjects in private sector as well as public sector databases, which means that in 185 days, in Europe, Europeans will be allowed to go to all the big data corporate platforms and say, give me all my data about me. And that's going to freak them out, right? Can you imagine? Like, nobody knows what that's going to look like, but that's what is going to happen. It also means that they can go to public institutions and say, give me all my health data about me and my, I don't know, tax data about me and so on. So we're going to start seeing new technologies like data pods and other things emerging where I'm going to be able to protect my own data, be sovereign over my data, and I will give certain people access rights to that. So we're going to see that emerge. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know what it's going to become, but that's changing. Data portability is that idea of the right to have access to the data in those systems, the right to access journals and so on that we've talked about, but this one is really interesting, that we're not, like, it's not even on anybody's agenda here, the right to explanation. That's the right to the algorithms. That's what's coming into law in Europe in 185 days. And we're not like, that's not even on our horizon, right? We're not like, we don't talk about that. We talk about the black box, but we're not putting in legislation or regulation that says, I have a right to know what you know about me, and I have a right to know how you know about me, and why you care about knowing about me, or members of my community, and so on. One thing that's not in there, and this is something that you're probably familiar with here because you're a bit further out from some of the main cities, although you're closer to Europe than most other Canadians are, the right to repair. Right? We don't have the right to repair our stuff. We get to buy it, but we don't have the right to repair it. We don't have the right to repair our phones. Now, they're going to be unlocked, but that doesn't mean we can repair them. It just means they're unlocked. We don't have will we have the right to repair our cars? Will we have the right to repair, like, you don't have the right necessarily to repair your tractor. So what is the right to repair? Do we get to repair our stuff and recycle our stuff? So if we're talking about sustainability, will we have that right to be able to do that? And where do we have that conversation? So to conclude, to be technological and data-based citizens, we need to have agency, we need to have knowledge, and we're the ones, like in this room, people like us who are working in this space, we have the knowledge to talk about data, technology, policy, law, and governance. And not only that, I would argue, I should have put it in there, we have the responsibility to do so, because we know it as citizens. I don't know a lot about forestry. As a geographer, I know something. I don't know a lot about forestry, so I leave it to the foresters to talk about forestry. But this is something that I know, and I have the responsibility to talk about, just like the foresters and the fishers have the responsibility to say something wrong with the fisheries, or there's something wrong with the water, or there's something wrong with the forest and we need to deal with that, or there's something wrong with the caribou herds that are moving and they're not moving where they should be. That's the responsibility of hunters and those other communities. My responsibility, and I would argue our responsibility, is to have these difficult conversations with each other, with our governments, with our institutions, with our procurement officers at the point of contract. Who has power? We do. We've got lots of power. And we especially have power because we have jobs and pensions. Like, I just got this gig, right? I can't believe what a real paycheck and a pension is at this point in time in my life. So imagine all the other people who are working in the service industry. They don't have time to do this kind of work, but we do. And we live in a safe country, and not a crazy one at this time. It could become crazy, but at this time it's not. We're lucky. So we should not let our country get crazy, and we should take responsibility over these things, and we should recognize how lucky we are to be here and to have the access to the resources, the tools, the techniques, the education, and the fact that we can have this kind of conversation with each other. And we're educated, right? Canadians are literate, and so on and so forth. And then the appropriate occasion to act, now, here. We need to act on these things now because these things are coming. It's not good enough to act once they're here, because then it's too late. We don't get to shape them in the way that we want. And so I would argue that now is the time for us to start bringing those conversations forward, to start mapping some of these policies onto all of these other great strategies and plans and infrastructures and open governments and open sciences. We need to map these policies on top of that, and we need to be thinking about the devices that we're embedding in the environment, what they're capturing about us, and just precisely what kind of communities do we want, what kind of societies do we want, what kind of environment do we want, and then we encode those values into the tools, techniques, practices, and technologies that we require. Thank you. Oh, il y a des cadeaux. There's presents.
Merci beaucoup. Thanks for this thought-provoking, activist-oriented, focused, and merci beaucoup de cette très belle présentation, très intéressante. J'ai particulièrement aimé la section sur les géographes. Étant géographe de formation, je peux vous dire, maybe I can share this story. When I was elected, somebody brought me to City Hall just to do a visit to various staff, and this guy was working in the GIS department. And I just asked them, well, what is this guy doing? You know, just I knew, but the technical guy told me, he said, you know, he prints maps. This guy prints maps for us, cool maps. And I said, well, what do you do? What does it show? Show, well, the roads and stuff like that. So where do these maps come from, and what kind of data do you have? Oh, we don't have a lot of data. You just print maps. So I decided on that day that we would hire a real GIS specialist at the municipality, and this has been a change, dramatic change in just a few months, because he was able to do the right job with the right tool. So geography is still a good profession. Merci beaucoup encore une fois, and please accept this token for our appreciation.
I love presents. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. On reprend une photo? OK. On est comme ça. Merci.
Thanks. Alors, la première journée de la conférence Govmaker tire à sa fin. Évidemment, elle a été riche et magnifique, comme vous le savez. Nous remercions donc tous les excellents conférenciers d'avoir pris le temps de partager leur expertise, leurs idées avec nous et d'engager la conversation. Merci donc aussi également à nos commanditaires, notre commanditaire Diamant, qui est le gouvernement du Nouveau-Brunswick, également tous nos commanditaires Argent, BONB et le Centre Pond-SPRN. Thank you to all our speakers and to our sponsors. Diamond sponsors Government of New Brunswick, as well as the silver sponsors BioNB and the Pond-SPRN Center. Au nom de mon coprésident, évidemment, Cheryl, et des organisateurs, je vous remercie de votre participation active aujourd'hui. We invite you to attend a reception that will just start in a few minutes, hosted by the New Brunswick Social Policy Research Network, which will commence in the foyer just in a few minutes, and meet more of your fellow Govmakers. The first drink is the courtesy of our hosts. We will see you back tomorrow morning at 8:30 morning for a keynote not to be missed by Alex Ryan on long tail stories of making labs works inside and outside government. Merci beaucoup encore une fois et bonne soirée.